Welcome, everybody, to the Great War Discussion Group. It's 4 o'clock and we need to get started. We have 23 people signed in. We will probably pick up a few more. The topic for this afternoon is Woodrow Wilson and the irony of fate. Presenter is Dennis Cross, who all of you know, and who has written 3 books, which we all have copies of, don't we?
I hope so.
Yeah, a little bit of a pitch there.
Thank you.
On the events of the years 1914 to 1919, and then some, actually. The topic, Dennis has taken a particular interest in Woodrow Wilson, and the topic for this afternoon is Woodrow Wilson and the irony of fate. Dennis, go ahead.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm talking about Woodrow Wilson and the irony of fate because this is all going to be about things that happened before the war started, and it's Woodrow Wilson and the years leading up to the war. So, in 1912, the progressive era in American politics was in full swing. In that year's presidential campaign, progressivism in all its forms was at the center of the political world. And that year's presidential campaign was and remains one of the most contentious and most consequential in American history. As the 1912 campaign season began, both of the 2 major parties confronted bitter internal feuds. And a third, the Socialist Party, was at the peak of its power and influence. It was a time when political party conventions really mattered. The Republicans gathered for their convention at the Chicago Coliseum on June 18th. The campaign for the Republican nomination was unprecedented, pitting the incumbent president against a former president of his own party. Former President Roosevelt's challenge to President Taft had been hard fought. Roosevelt had won most of the primaries, including, most impressively, in Taft's home state of Ohio. In 1912, however, most delegates were chosen not in primaries, but by the state parties in state conventions, caucuses, or simply by the party leadership. In most states, the outcome was controlled by the party machinery, which favored the incumbent president, even against a challenge by a former president. In some states, the party leaders named delegates supporting Taft, but insurgents named rival slates supporting Roosevelt. This happened most frequently in southern states, where the Republican establishment traditionally sent so-called black and tan delegations to the convention, and it was, as the term implies, it referred to the race of the delegates. This made sense in a way because there were very few white Republicans in those states, and black and tan citizens were practically the only ones who supported the party of Lincoln. The problem, of course, was that when it came to the general election, black and tan voters were hard to find due to state laws enacted in the 1890s that had been specifically designed to deny them the vote. To challenge the establishment, therefore, Roosevelt, the progressive, was in the ironic position of having to challenge the black and tan leadership by supporting so-called lily white delegations, which he argued correctly were more representative of the Republicans who would actually be voting. Roosevelt brought his challenges in those states to the convention, where they were presented to the Republican National Committee, which was controlled as usual by supporters of the incumbent president. So it was not surprising that of 254 contested seats, the committee voted to award 235 to Taft and 19 to Roosevelt. Now it was up to the convention to make the final decision. Roosevelt, departing from the tradition that candidates for the nomination did not attend the convention, had traveled to Chicago, announcing on the way that he had decided to support women's suffrage. When he arrived in Chicago 2 days before the convention opened, he told reporters that he felt as strong as a bull moose, an image that was promptly picked up by the press as a symbol of his campaign. Addressing a group of his supporters in Chicago, he denounced the National Committee's vote to recommend awarding most of the disputed delegates to Taft. And for the first time, he threatened to bolt the party, saying, "The parting of the ways has come. We fight in honorable fashion for the good of mankind, fearless of the future, unheeding of our individual fates. With unflinching hearts and undimmed eyes, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." The convention's first order of business was the selection of a chairman. Senator Elihu Root was Taft's choice. A loyal mainstream Republican and longtime supporter of both Taft and Roosevelt, Root had been Secretary of War under President McKinley and continued in that position under Roosevelt, who appointed him Secretary of State when John Hay died in 1905. In 1909, as Roosevelt's term ended, the New York legislature chose Root to represent the state in the Senate. And that was because, of course, the 17th Amendment, which provided for popular election of senators, was still in the future. Like Henry Cabot Lodge and many other establishment Republicans, Root supported Roosevelt during his tenure as president, but declined to support his attempt this year to deny the nomination to an incumbent Republican president. In the balloting for chairman, the convention selected Root over Governor Francis McGovern of Wisconsin, who was the choice of the Roosevelt delegates, by a vote of 558 to 501. So it was a pretty close vote. The convention then took up the Roosevelt forces challenge to 72 of the Taft delegates that had been seated by the National Committee and confirmed by the Credentials Committee. Governor Herbert Hadley of Missouri, a Roosevelt supporter, asked the chairman for a ruling that those 72 delegates could not vote on their own qualifications. Root ruled that each of the challenged Taft delegates would be voted on separately, and that while no delegate could vote on his own qualifications, each could vote on the qualifications of the other 71. This vote effectively ensured that the Taft delegates would be seated. As the challenges to the Taft delegates were voted on and defeated one by one, the convention hall echoed with cries of steamroller, toot toot, and choo choo from the Roosevelt forces. When it was over, Roosevelt released a statement which was read to the convention, accusing the Taft forces of theft. It asserted that the convention, as now composed, has no claim to represent the voters of the Republican Party, and that no one accepting the nomination under such circumstances could ask the support of any honest man. Most of the Roosevelt delegates left the convention hall or refused to vote, and the convention adopted the platform proposed by the Taft delegates and nominated Taft for president on the first ballot. Vice President James S. Sherman, Sonny Jim Sherman, was also nominated for a second term. Roosevelt delegates gathered across town in Orchestra Hall and nominated Roosevelt for president. Roosevelt appeared and promised to make the fight even if only one state should support me. The next week, the Democratic Party convened at the 5th Regiment Armory in Baltimore. The delegates to the Democratic Convention had every reason to be optimistic about their prospects. Not only was the Republican Party in an unprecedented state of disarray, But the most recent midterm congressional elections, traditionally a harbinger of the upcoming presidential election year, had seen a pronounced swing in the Democrats' favor. For the first time in 16 years, the Democrats had won the House of Representatives, ending the long Republican dominance under the iron-fisted speakerships of Thomas B. Czar Reed. Czar was his nickname because he was iron-fisted. And Joseph G. Uncle Joe Cannon. The Senate, only 1/3 of whose seats had been on the ballot in 1910, still had a Republican majority, but the number of Republican senators had fallen from 60 to 52. And the Republicans' prospects for retaining their Senate majority in 1912 were bleak. The Democrats' optimism, however, was tempered by the fact that as the convention approached, no candidate had enough committed delegates to secure the nomination. And also by the fact that the party was far from united in anything other than its thirst for victory. In 1912, the Democracy, as the party called itself, had at least 4 major power centers, always competing and often openly hostile. By far the largest and most influential bloc was the so-called Solid South, made even more solid by the legislation, the state legislations of the 1890s that I referred to earlier. The states of the Confederacy had been reliably Democratic since the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s. Southerners identified the Republicans with the South's defeat in the Civil War and with the federal government's efforts after the war to impose racial equality, efforts that were resented by most white Southerners. With the end of Reconstruction and the return of the Democratic Party to power in those states, white Southerners regained control of their state governments. And when coalitions of white populists and Black Republicans threatened Democratic Party dominance in the 1890s, Southern Democrats responded with state laws and constitutional amendments designed to eliminate African Americans as a political force, but by depriving them of the vote. Measures such as literacy tests and poll taxes were adopted in state after state and remained in place, largely achieving their purpose until the Supreme Court began to strike them down half a century later. No African Americans were elected to Congress from any state from 1900 to 1928, and none from the South until 1972. As the 1912 Democratic Convention approached, the Republican populist threat had receded, and the South was solidly Democratic and unapologetically racist. Its size and influence in the Democratic Party, however, had thus far not included the power to dictate the nomination of its own citizens. No Southerner had been nominated for president since 1848. Since then, the party had selected Northerners who were acceptable to the South rather than nominating Southerners themselves. The pictures here are of 4 of the prominent Southern Democrats in 1912. The South's veto power was secured by a rule requiring a two-thirds vote for the party's nomination, which ensured that no one could be nominated who was opposed by a united South. The second substantial bloc was made up of social radicals or populist progressives who looked to William Jennings Bryan as their leader. This faction traced its origin in the party to the 1896 convention when Bryan delivered his Cross of Gold speech and won his first of 3 presidential nominations. These Democratic Party progressives agreed with the Republican progressives on some issues, but drew their support mainly from the rural South and West. They were thus a different breed from the Roosevelt progressives, largely Eastern and urban, who had bolted the Republican Party in Chicago. Their different makeup was reflected in the different emphasis they brought to progressive issues. Thus, while the Roosevelt progressives emphasized ballot reforms such as the preferential primary, initiative referendum, and recall, Bryan progressives were more likely to emphasize populist themes such as prohibition, women's suffrage, monetary reform, and attacking banks and monopolies. Unlike the South, this faction of the Democratic Party had been quite successful in getting its candidate nominated, though not at all successful in getting him elected. Bryan had been the Democratic nominee in 1896, 1900, and 1908, losing all three races. In 1912, Bryan knew he was unlikely to be the nominee for a fourth time, but he was determined to play an influential role in the convention. He was there as a member of the Nebraska delegation. A third influential faction in the Democratic Party was made up of Eastern conservatives, sometimes called Bourbon Democrats or Gold Democrats. This faction traced its lineage to Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate in the disputed election of 1876 against Rutherford B. Hayes, and Grover Cleveland, the last Democratic president and the only successful Democratic nominee since the Civil War. These Democrats had earned the gold designation by opposing Bryan's free silver plank, which was the theme of his Cross of Gold speech, in 1896, and they continued to oppose most of the Bryan faction's progressive positions. They had won a temporary victory with the nomination of Judge Alton B. Parker in 1904, but his unimpressive showing that year against Roosevelt had reduced their power within the party. Finally, there was Tammany Hall. Tammany had dominated politics in New York City since the 1850s. Under leaders William Marcy Tweed, John Kelly, and Richard Croker, and other powerful Tammany politicians such as George Washington Plunkett and Big Tim Sullivan, Tammany Hall had become synonymous with machine politics, corruption, and graft. It was Plunkett who famously distinguished between honest graft and dishonest graft. The leader of Tammany Hall in 1912 was Charles Francis Murphy, who had held that position since 1902 and would continue to hold it until his death in 1924. He was arguably the most powerful leader in Tammany's history, and he would be largely responsible later on for the rise of Alfred E. Smith in New York politics a few years later. The high watermark of Tammany's influence came after Murphy's death, when Al Smith won the Democratic nomination for president in 1928. Tammany's fall came shortly thereafter when Franklin D. Roosevelt, an anti-Tammany New York Democrat, became president and cut Tammany off from federal patronage. Almost simultaneously, a corruption investigation forced New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker, a Tammany man, from office. But all that was in the future. In 1912, Tammany's power was still a major force in the party. In Baltimore, it would control the 90 votes of the New York delegation, by far the largest at the convention. The candidate with the most committed delegates going into the convention was the new Speaker of the House, Champ Clark of Missouri. He had represented his district in the House of Representatives since 1893. He succeeded to the leadership of the House Democrats in 1907, when John Sharp Williams of Mississippi moved to the Senate, and he became the Speaker following the Democratic victory in the congressional elections of 1910. He enjoyed a fast and unexpected rise to prominence in the pre-election campaign, capturing the Missouri delegation in an 11th hour campaign and going on to impressive showings in primary contests and state conventions across the country. He was an organization politician with considerable support among his congressional colleagues and local machine leaders. But at the same time, he had succeeded in identifying himself with the progressive elements of the party. He was counting on the support of Bryan, who was pledged to vote for him as a member of the Nebraska delegation. A year earlier, the leading aspirant for the nomination had been Woodrow Wilson, the newly elected governor of New Jersey. A Virginian by birth and a resident Southerner most of his life, Wilson was a fresh face on the political scene. An academic by profession, he had written several books on politics and government, mostly expressing a conservative point of view. As president of Princeton University, he had earned a reputation as a reformer, though not always a successful one, having failed to achieve some reforms he had deemed important. He ran for governor of New Jersey in 1910 at the behest of the New Jersey Democratic machine and was elected on a progressive platform. To the dismay of the machine, he embarked at once on a crusade to actually carry out the progressive measures he had advocated in the campaign. As the pre-convention campaign got underway, he did well in the primaries, but was less successful than Clark in rounding up delegates in state conventions. By convention time, his star seemed to be fading. For the first time since the Civil War, the Deep South had a serious candidate for the nomination. Like Champ Clark, Representative Oscar W. Underwood of Alabama had risen to the House leadership in the Democratic victories of 1910. In his case, to the chairmanship of the Ways and Means Committee. First elected to the House in 1894, he had made a name for himself as an expert on tariff issues. He would courageously oppose the Ku Klux Klan when it was revived in the 1920s, but we're still in 1912. And in 1912, he was known for having led a successful campaign in his state, in Alabama, for a state constitution that effectively eliminated the African American vote under the slogan, "White supremacy, honest elections, and the new Constitution, one and inseparable." He was regarded as a conservative and had been branded a reactionary by Bryan when he had refused to do Bryan's bidding on a tariff bill before the House. Underwood's hopes for the nomination rested on the possibility that neither Clark nor Wilson would be able to achieve the necessary two-thirds vote. The last of the candidates, other than favorite sons, such as Governor Thomas R. Marshall of Indiana, who later gets the vice presidential nomination, was Governor Judson Harmon of Ohio. He was the first to announce his candidacy, but had not been as successful as the others in rounding up delegates, failing to win a decisive victory even in his own state. As a conservative without a substantial block of committed delegates, his prospects for the nomination were dim. The fireworks started the week before the convention began. Bryan had been in Chicago as a correspondent covering the Republican convention when he learned of the Democratic National Committee's recommendation that Judge Alton B. Parker, remember that name, he had been the conservative Democratic nominee in 1904. The committee's recommendation that Parker be chosen as the convention's temporary chairman and keynote speaker. Parker had been the party's nominee in 1904, the only election year of the previous four in which the party had failed to nominate Bryan. Determined to play a major role in the convention, Bryan decided to start here. He sent identical telegrams to the announced candidates for the nomination, asking them to join him in opposing Parker. Both Wilson and Clark had claimed the progressive label and sought Bryan's endorsement for the nomination. Bryan had made it clear that the conservative candidates Harmon and Underwood were unacceptable. Clark, a longtime supporter of Bryan, who was trying to remain on good terms with all factions in the party, sent Bryan a cordial but non-committal reply. Wilson, a more recent convert to the progressive cause, replied with a strong endorsement of Bryan's position. The convention was called to order on June 25th. At the outset, it was clear that no candidate had the support of the 728 delegates, 2/3 of the total, that was necessary for the nomination. Based on his primary victories and his success in a number of state party conventions, Clark appeared to have the advantage. His reply to Bryan's telegram was typical of Clark's approach, in which his main goal was to avoid alienating any potential supporters. In the floor contest between Parker and Bryan for the temporary chairmanship, Parker narrowly prevailed, but Wilson's forthright support of Bryan would pay dividends. The Wilson forces prevailed in two other preliminary votes, one that struck down unit rules imposed by state conventions on delegates selected by primaries. The only state affected was Ohio, in which a minority of the delegates wished to vote for Wilson. So that was a victory for Wilson. And one that seated Wilson rather than Clark delegates from South Dakota. At this point, Bryan stirred the pot again. He introduced a resolution declaring the convention's opposition to the nomination of any candidate for president who is the representative of or under obligation to J. Pierpont Morgan, Thomas F. Ryan, August Belmont, or any other member of the privilege hunting or favor seeking class, and demanded the withdrawal from the convention of any delegate constituting or representing the above named interests. After the pandemonium subsided, Bryan withdrew the latter language, which demanded withdrawal of delegates, and the resolution passed easily with even the Virginia delegation, of which Thomas Ryan himself was a member, voting for it. The stage was now set for the balloting. Because Clark had a substantial lead in pledged delegates, Wilson's immediate challenge was to prevent Clark's nomination on an early ballot. The Texas delegation, which was solidly for Wilson thanks to the preliminary work of Colonel Edward M. House and other Wilson men in the state, began working the Underwood delegates from the Deep South states, promising Texas's vote for Underwood if Wilson should begin to falter in return for those delegations' promise not to vote for Clark as long as Wilson remained viable. When the balloting began, Clark got off to a strong start, leading Wilson by about 100 votes on each of the first 9 ballots. As I said, conventions were different in those days. Then Tammany Hall, which controlled New York's 90 votes and had been casting them for Governor Harmon, decided that the psychologically auspicious time had come. On the 10th ballot, Tammany threw its support to Clark. With Tammany's switch, Clark now had the votes of a majority of the delegates, but still less than the necessary 2/3. No candidate since the Civil War who received a majority vote had failed to win the party's nomination. Nevertheless, the 2/3 rule gave the South an effective veto. And at this point, the delegations from the Deep South, honoring their deal with the Texas delegation and still hoping for their candidate's nomination, exercised that veto by continuing to cast their votes for Underwood. Ironically, Wilson had become the beneficiary of the same 2/3 rule that he had earlier opposed and had attempted unsuccessfully to persuade the Democratic National Committee to repeal. 4 ballots later, Bryan moved another obstacle into Clark's path to the nomination. As a member of the Nebraska delegation, he was committed to vote for Clark on the early ballots, and he had done so. But when the roll call reached Nebraska on the 14th ballot, he rose and asked for permission to explain his vote. Striding to the podium, he told the convention he was switching his vote from Clark to Wilson. He explained that because Tammany Hall had now given its support to Clark, Clark's nomination would be tainted by having been brought about by the interests, and told the delegates that as long as New York committed to vote for Clark, he would refuse to cast his vote for Speaker Clark. Bryan's pledge was less than an unqualified endorsement of Wilson, since it would presumably also require him to oppose Wilson's should he receive New York's vote. More likely, Bryan had in mind a possible convention deadlock, creating the possibility that it might turn for a fourth time to Bryan himself. The immediate effect, however, was to begin a gradual slippage of votes in Wilson's favor. On the 20th ballot, Kansas switched its votes from Clark to Wilson. Massachusetts abandoned Clark for a favorite son on the 22nd ballot, and on the 24th ballot, Wilson's vote total topped 400 for the first time. At the end of the day, on Saturday, June 29th, the 26th ballot still had Wilson trailing 407.5 votes to Clark's 463.5. The following day, being Sunday, the convention took the day off, and the month of June ended with the nomination still in doubt, as an alarmed Speaker Clark rushed to Baltimore to rally his supporters. While the trend seemed to favor Wilson, he was still a long way from a majority, let alone the 2/3 vote necessary to prevail. On Monday, July 1st, the convention resumed. The 27th ballot was uneventful, but on the next ballot, Indiana switched its vote from Governor Thomas Marshall, its favorite son candidate, to Wilson. 2 ballots later, Wilson's vote total overtook Clark's for the first time. With the 43rd ballot Tuesday morning, Wilson had a majority, and at 3:30 that afternoon, the 46th ballot gave him the nomination. Oscar W. Underwood, whose delegations from the Deep South had blocked Clark's nomination after Tammany switched to Clark on the 10th ballot, was offered the vice presidential nomination, but he declined it. The nomination then went to Governor Marshall, who switched to Wilson Monday morning, gave his candidacy a badly needed boost at a critical moment. Governor Wilson had followed the proceedings in Baltimore from the governor's summer residence in Seagirt, New Jersey. On July 20th, his defeated adversary, Speaker Champ Clark, led a delegation of Democratic congressmen to Seagirt to assure Wilson of their support in the general election. On August 7th, the official notification ceremony took place, also at Seagirt. It was a number of years before FDR became the first nominee to actually go to the convention and accept the nomination in person at the convention. So what is Teddy Roosevelt doing? The progressive supporters of former President Roosevelt were less accommodating than Champ Clark, adamantly refusing to accept their party's nomination of President Taft for another term. On July 7th, 63 Republican leaders from 40 states issued a call for delegates to meet at a national progressive convention for the purpose of nominating candidates for president and vice president of the United States. The convention took place on August 5th in the same Chicago Coliseum that had housed the Republican convention 7 weeks earlier. On the opening day, the Coliseum rang with the voices of delegates singing Onward Christian Soldiers and Battle Hymn of the Republic. On the second day, Roosevelt appeared and was greeted by an ovation that lasted 57 minutes. He repeated the call to arms he had first issued during the Republican convention. We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. The next day, the delegates voted unanimously to give him the party's nomination for president. And Governor Hiram Johnson of California was nominated for vice president. In 1912, for the only time in American history, 3 presidents, one former, one future, and one incumbent, competed for the office. Rounding out the field was a 4th candidate, Eugene V. Debs, representing the Socialist Party at the height of its power and influence. Incumbent President William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's chosen successor 4 years earlier, was the most conservative candidate in the race, but he had continued many of the progressive policies of his predecessor, including vigorous enforcement of the antitrust laws. One of Roosevelt's most controversial positions in his campaign was his support of recall, not only of elected officials, but also of judges and even judicial decisions. Now he took the argument a step further. In a speech at the Denver Auditorium on September 19th, in the course of answering a question posed by William Jennings Bryan in Pueblo the night before, Roosevelt said that he favors subjecting even the president to the possibility of recall. Bryan's question was, how many terms may a president serve? A question designed to call attention to the fact that Roosevelt had already served almost 2 complete terms, and that this election year would give him an unprecedented tenure of almost 12 years if he won. Roosevelt answered Bryan's question by arguing that the 2-term tradition applied only to consecutive terms. The presidential campaign took a dramatic turn as it entered its final weeks. At about 8 o'clock in the evening of October 14th, in front of the Hotel Gilpatrick in Milwaukee, Roosevelt was shot as he was entering an automobile to go to the auditorium to deliver a campaign speech. The would-be assassin approached Roosevelt and fired once at close range. He was identified as John Schrank, a New York City saloon keeper who objected to Roosevelt's bid for a 3rd term. Schrank had been stalking Roosevelt for some time, following him from Charleston to Atlanta to Chicago and several cities in between, before catching up with him in Milwaukee. The bullet entered Roosevelt's right breast, its force diminished by striking Roosevelt's glasses case and the manuscript of the speech he was about to deliver. Albert Martin, one of Roosevelt's secretaries who was accompanying Roosevelt, jumped on Schrank and knocked him to the ground, preventing a second shot. As Schrank was pulled to his feet, the angry crowd pushed forward with cries of "Lynch him, kill him!" Apparently, lynch him was an acceptable expression of anger in those days. Roosevelt raised his hand and called for the crowd to stand back, saying he was unhurt. Only after Roosevelt was in the automobile on his way to the auditorium was it noticed that he had been shot. Opening his coat and showing the audience his bloodstained shirt, Roosevelt boasted that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose, and proceeded to speak for approximately an hour. After speaking, he was taken to a hospital where it was determined that the bullet had lodged in the chest wall and had not entered the lung. He was given medical clearance to travel to Chicago, his next destination. After a few days in a Chicago hospital, he returned to his home in Oyster Bay, New York. He gave no more speeches until October 30th, when he addressed a crowd of 16,000 at Madison Square Garden. He was greeted affectionately by the partisan audience, but seemed subdued in his delivery, showing the strain of his recent injury. Wilson also resumed his campaign at the end of the month, having suspended it while Roosevelt was recovering. The day after Roosevelt's appearance there, he went to Madison Square Garden, where he was given an enthusiastic welcome. President Taft spent most of October at his summer home in Beverly, Massachusetts, returning to Washington on October 26th. He did not entirely neglect his campaign for re-election, making a brief visit to New York City and several speeches in the New England area while he was staying in Beverly. His campaign suffered a setback on October 3rd when the California Supreme Court ruled that the names of his electors could not be on the ballot in that state as Republicans, because electors pledged to Roosevelt had won the Republican primary. On election day, Wilson won an Electoral College landslide. But running against 2 strong candidates, he garnered less than 42% of the vote. He was only the second Democrat to be elected to the presidency since the Civil War. The first, Grover Cleveland, was elected by much slimmer Electoral College margins in 1884 and 1892 and lost by an equally slim margin in 1888. Despite the efforts of Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign to appeal to white Southerners, the Democratic Party retained its grip on the Solid South, aided in part by the fact that Wilson was a native Southerner and in part by the widespread disenfranchisement of Negroes, which is we've discussed before. And most of them would likely have voted Republican, but since they're a minority in most states, the Democrats would probably still have carried the Solid South. Outside the South, no state gave Wilson a majority, but he won a plurality in most of them thanks to the split Republican vote. If I remember correctly, he got over 90% of the vote in Mississippi, so and South Carolina. After a post-election vacation in Bermuda, President-elect Wilson returned to New York on December 15th, and on December 17th, he attended a dinner party given by the Southern Society at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where the nation's first Southern-born president since Zachary Taylor was given an enthusiastic reception. In his speech, Wilson saluted the men of Virginia for their willingness during the Civil War to fight to the death for the things in which they believed. He said that although slavery was of no economic benefit, they fought for the principle that they had the right to order their own affairs. He then addressed the concerns of the business community, saying that while many think the new administration may disturb business, that will not happen except as it disturbs the minds of businessmen. And he promised to build a gibbet high as Haman's for anyone who would use the machinery of the markets to precipitate a panic. On his way back to Washington on December 21st, he stopped in Trenton, New Jersey to confer with William Jennings Bryan. Given his longtime leadership of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and his key role in securing Wilson's nomination in Baltimore, Bryan was presumed to be the president-elect's inevitable choice for Secretary of State. Resisting efforts by Missouri Governor Herbert Hadley and others to reunify the Republican Party, Roosevelt spoke at a Progressive Party conference in Chicago on December 9th. He denounced both political parties and vowed a 4-year fight for progressive principles in every state. The conference unanimously adopted a resolution endorsing Roosevelt for president in 1916. Outgoing President Taft accepted an offer from Yale to join its faculty as Kemp Professor of Law. Shortly thereafter, he and Mrs. Taft left on an inspection trip to the Panama Canal. On Christmas Day, as he was on his way to a celebration in his honor in Panama City, an explosion destroyed a kiosk a few minutes after he passed by. The president and his party were not injured. The following day, before his departure, Taft announced his selection of Colonel George Washington Goethals, the canal's chief engineer, to be the first civil governor of the canal zone. Wilson and his running mate Thomas Marshall were inaugurated on March 4th, 1913. In his inaugural address, Wilson made no mention of foreign affairs, outlining in general terms the domestic policy goals embodied in the new freedom that had been the theme of his campaign. His principal interest and his principal qualification for the presidency was and always had been domestic policy and governance. Shortly before his inauguration, he wrote in a letter to a friend that it would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. You see the West Point cadets and the Annapolis midshipmen lined up on either side of the speaker's stand there. That's, as far as I know, the only time they've actually been that close to the speaker at the inauguration. On the morning of March 4th, his last day in office, President Taft signed a bill dividing the Department of Commerce and Labor into two separate cabinet departments. The next day, President Wilson submitted the names of 10 cabinet nominees, including one for the new position of Secretary of Labor, to the Senate for confirmation. As expected, William Jennings Bryan was named Secretary of State. The position of Secretary of the Treasury went to William Gibbs McAdoo, and the War and Navy offices went to New Jersey Vice Chancellor Lindley Garrison and North Carolina newspaper editor Josephus Daniels. Meeting in special session, the Senate confirmed all of them that day. Bryan was the obvious and perhaps unavoidable choice for Secretary of State, the senior position of the cabinet. But the reasons were entirely political, based on Bryan's dominant position in the party and his decisive and well-timed moves in Wilson's favor at the Baltimore Convention. He lacked any experience in foreign policy, and his strongest conviction in the field of foreign policy was that war was to be avoided at all costs. His new idea was to promote cooling off treaties in which the nations of the world would promise to submit their disputes to arbitration and wait a number of months before declaring war. He agreed to accept the job of Secretary of State only with the understanding that he would be allowed to campaign for Democratic candidates in the 1914 midterm elections and to supplement his income by continuing to make appearances on the Chautauqua circuit. Then, as now, there was also a White House staff. Unlike later years, however, there was no press secretary, no appointment secretary, no chief of staff, and none of the hundreds of other positions that make up the White House staff today. In the Wilson administration, the White House staff consisted of a single person, Joseph P. Tumulty, a New Jersey politician who had been Wilson's secretary when he was governor of New Jersey and continued as secretary to the president in the Wilson White House. Tumulty, at least, was a federal government employee. The man who was Wilson's closest and most influential advisor was not. Colonel Edward M. House, so-called Colonel, a title that had been bestowed years earlier by the governor of Texas, had played an important behind-the-scenes role at the Baltimore Convention. He was told that he could have any cabinet position other than Secretary of State, but he declined, preferring the flexibility and power that came with his personal relationship with Wilson. The newly elected Congress was called into special session on April 8th to hear an address from the new president. This was the first time in over 100 years that a president had gone to the floor of Congress to promote his legislative program. The last president to do so was John Adams, who addressed Congress in person in 1801. His successor, Thomas Jefferson, discontinued the practice, and until Wilson revived it, every president fulfilled his constitutional duty to give Congress information of the State of the Union once a year by means of written messages sent to Congress and read to each house by the clerk. The 63rd Congress that was called into special session to hear President Wilson's speech remained in continuous session for 567 days. I think that's a record. Until October of 1914, after a war had broken out in Europe. Apart from its extraordinary length, the 63rd Congress, that session of the 63rd Congress was unusually productive in terms of legislative output, among which were tariff reform, adoption of a federal income tax, and the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Before adjourning, Congress enacted and sent to the president 2 additional pieces of legislation with lasting importance. One outlawed unfair trade practices and established a Federal Trade Commission to oversee corporate behavior. The other, the Clayton Act, named for former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee who sponsored the bill, augmented the Sherman Act by providing protections for organized labor. And by specifying prohibited anti-competitive activities such as interlocking directorates, price discrimination, and anti-competitive corporate mergers. Advocacy of these measures by a Democratic president and their enactment by a Democratic Congress caused many progressives to abandon their support of the Progressive Party in favor of the Democrats. Former President Roosevelt, however, was not one of them. His domestic policy successes during the first year of his presidency seemed to confirm Wilson's prediction that his administration would deal mostly with domestic affairs. Most of the foreign policy issues involved Mexico, where the reform president Francisco Madero had been overthrown and murdered by General Victoriano Huerta shortly before Wilson's inauguration. Wilson refused to recognize the Huerta regime and in August imposed an arms embargo that weakened Huerta's defense against attacks from another insurrectionist, General Venustiano Carranza. Tension with Mexico came to a head in April 1914 when sailors from a U.S. Navy squadron under the command of Rear Admiral Henry Mayo were arrested in Tampico. The arresting officer's superior officer released the Americans with an apology, but Admiral Mayo issued an ultimatum demanding that the arresting officer be punished and that the local Mexican garrison raise the American flag and render a 21-gun salute. When word of Admiral Mayo's ultimatum reached Washington, President Wilson decided that American honor required that it be complied with under threat of military reprisal. General Huerta, head of the de facto Mexican government in Mexico City, gave evasive replies, asking, for example, why the United States attached such importance to a salute from a government it did not recognize. On April 18th, the president issued a new ultimatum with a 24-hour deadline. When the deadline passed without a satisfactory response, Wilson asked Congress for authorization to use military force. The requested resolution was adopted by the House of Representatives on April 20th and by the Senate on April 21st. While the president's request was still pending, he learned that a German steamer was en route to Veracruz with a shipment of arms for the Huerta regime and ordered the commander of an American squadron anchored off Veracruz to put forces ashore, seize the customs house, and prevent the landing of war supplies. American sailors and Marines eventually occupied the entire city, which remained under American occupation until November, when they were withdrawn following mediation by the ABC powers, that's Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, acted as arbitrators. Another foreign policy challenge Wilson inherited when he assumed the presidency was a dispute with Great Britain over Panama Canal tolls. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty of 1901, which had superseded the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850, gave the United States the right to build and operate a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, but with the condition that all nations would have access to the canal on equal terms. In the last year of the Taft administration, Congress passed and the president signed legislation exempting tolls for American ships traveling between American ports. The British government protested the exemption as a violation of the treaty, and in March 1914, President Wilson asked Congress to repeal the free tolls provision. It pretty obviously was in violation of the treaty. After much resistance, including from the president's own party, the repeal finally became law on June 11th. In May 1914, former President Roosevelt returned from an extended trip to South America in which he had barely survived a dangerous expedition with his son Kermit and others down the River of Doubt, a previously unexplored tributary of the Amazon. By June, he had recovered enough to travel to Spain for Kermit's wedding to the daughter of the American ambassador. Another presidential wedding took place in May when President Wilson's daughter, Eleanor, married the Secretary of the Treasury, William G. McAdoo, in the White House. In the spring of 1914, Colonel House was sufficiently concerned as he reviewed the growing tensions in Europe that he proposed a mission to Europe to explore the possibility of arms limitation agreements and a possible new international structure to reduce the risk of a European war. After attending the president's daughter's wedding in the White House, he sailed for Europe. In Germany, he met with Admiral Tirpitz and other officials and had a brief private conversation with the Kaiser during a military festival called Schrippenfest. Then he traveled to London, where he met with Ambassador Page and British statesmen, including Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey. These are the U.S. ambassadors to Britain and Germany and the British and German ambassadors to the U.S. in 1914. Former President Roosevelt was still in London in the spring of 1914 on his way back home after his son's wedding. He called on members of the government and opposition members of parliament and addressed the Royal Geographic Society, where he reported on his recent exploration of the Amazon. He returned to New York on the Hamburg America liner SS Imperator, the same liner that had taken Colonel House to Germany a month earlier. He arrived home on June 24th. So lots of traveling going on in the summer of 1914. On June 28th, while Colonel House was still in London and Teddy Roosevelt had just returned home, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's nephew and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were shot and killed while on a state visit to Sarajevo, the capital of the recently annexed Austrian province of Bosnia and Herzegovina. When he received the news in Washington, President Wilson sent a message of condolence to Emperor Franz Joseph. He was not yet aware that his wife was suffering from a kidney disease that would take her life in a little over a month. The assassination of the Archduke might have led to a third Balkan War. Instead, it triggered the general European war that Colonel House had feared, pitting the great powers against each other in a global Armageddon that alters the course of world history. By the end of August, not only is Austria-Hungary at war with Serbia, but Russia, Belgium, France, and Great Britain are at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And because those nations rule much of the globe, the war extends beyond Europe to Africa, Asia, and the oceans of the world. Germany attacks Belgium and France. Russia attacks Germany. And Great Britain sends an army across the Channel to join the French and Belgians. The Grand Fleet takes up its war station at Scapa Flow, and British naval forces attack the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea. 2 German warships in the Mediterranean escape a pursuing British squadron and join the Turkish Navy in the Black Sea. Austrian ships bombarding the coast of Montenegro are attacked by French and British naval forces from Malta. Following up on its ultimatum, Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. Japan declares war on Germany and attacks German colonies in the Far East. And the German East Asia Squadron, outmatched by the Japanese and British fleets, begins a long journey across the Pacific. As if that weren't enough, for the month of August 1914, there were some other events. Mrs. Wilson died in the White House. The Pope dies in the Vatican. The New York Stock Exchange is closed, and the Panama Canal is opened. The United States declares its neutrality, and President Wilson urges Americans to be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action, a goal that proves far easier to state than to achieve. From now on, Wilson's administration will not only have to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. On a global scale, it will be dominated by foreign affairs on a global scale at a watershed moment in world history. With less experience in foreign affairs than either of his predecessors, he now confronts the irony of his fate. Charlie, thank you. Thank you to all of you for listening. And I'd be happy to continue the conversation with questions or.
Walking along the Rue Woodrow Wilson. It's actually the avenue of President Wilson. I don't know if you can see you probably can't see the picture, but it's the avenue, it's the President Wilson Avenue in Paris, still remaining as an indicator of the extent to which the Wilson administration dealt, for good and ill, with foreign affairs. Anyone have any questions for Dennis? Or comments?
Of course, the French obsession with Woodrow Wilson came later, when he was welcomed to Paris in 1919, end of 1918, beginning of 1919, as the savior.
Based upon your research, do you agree with the premise of that more recent book that Wilson really tried to broker a peace between the primary warring nations a couple years later?
Well, yes, I'm not sure. It's a book that I'm familiar with, but he certainly once the decision was made for the U.S. to enter the war, which was April of 1917, he wanted very much for the United States to play a leading role, and then I think his focus from then on was to be not only the warrior but the peacemaker. And when in the fall of 1918, as when the German army proposed an armistice on the basis of the 14 points, the 14 points was an address to Congress, one of the many addresses to Congress that Woodrow Wilson went ahead and made during his administration. The 14 points was a proposed outline for a peace, or at least a cessation of hostilities in the war, that he gave to Congress in January of 1918. And so in the fall of 1918, as the Germans were really on the ropes and about to be badly defeated, they sent a message not to Great Britain or France or Russia, which was by then out of the war, but to the newcomer, Woodrow Wilson, saying, we kind of like those 14 points as the basis for negotiation. And we propose an armistice based on the 14 points that you delivered to Congress a few months ago. And that led to a series of exchanges of notes in the September and October of 1918 that led eventually to the armistice that was signed on November 11th. And so, yeah, he played a very prominent, probably more prominent than he deserved, role in bringing the fighting to an end in 1918. And then when the peace conference convened in Paris in January of 1919, he had a leading role and really more than a leading role. And he was the only head of state to be there, and he took advantage of that and took a very leading role, although he didn't get everything he wanted. So I guess the answer to your question is yes, I agree with what I just said anyway. So,
Dennis, this is Ken. Going back to the election of 1912.
Yes.
So the Republican Party strategized, or made every effort to get their incumbent Taft nominated.
Right.
And then Roosevelt just totally destroyed Taft's candidacy, at the time of the election. Did the Republican Party go through any soul searching as to, how they could avoid, that kind of a fate going forward? I mean, that was a tremendous debacle for them. Yeah.
Yes, it was. It was a disaster. And I think even Roosevelt himself realized that it was not something he wanted to repeat in 1916. And by 1916, he was back on board with the Republicans, much to the dismay and anger, really, of many of the progressives who had followed him out of the party in 1912. And it's not that he reconciled with Taft necessarily. It was a different. The 1916 Republican nominee was Charles Evans Hughes, who had himself been a progressive, although he had been on the Supreme Court in 1912. So he was able to stay completely out of the fight between the progressive and establishment Republicans that took place that year. But before he was on the court, he was governor of New York, and he had a reputation as a pretty progressive politician. So the nomination of Charles Evans Hughes was really kind of gave the Republican Party a lifeline to bring together the factions of the party that had been fighting so bitterly in 1912.
Dennis, it may be worth asking how much the events of the convention influenced Wilson's policy once he was in office, because he's widely known, despite being a progressive, he was widely known as being an unashamed racist. And
yes,
as we all know from going through the exhibit on the Black citizenship, Wilson was an unmitigated disaster for the role of Blacks in the federal government, and indeed for the cause of Black progressivism overall. It seems very clear how much he actually owed to the Southern Bloc and the Democratic Party for winning him the nomination.
Yes.
How much of that was payback to them, and how much of that was his own his own convictions may be difficult to sort out.
I think his own convictions and his political goals in 1912 were very much in line with each other. I think he was essentially a white Southerner, who he wasn't as bad as some of them, but and if you were to when he was actually put in a position where he had to respond on questions of racial justice and so forth, he would say that he's all for it. but as far as actual policies are concerned, I think I mentioned the one speech he gave where he was talking about how the South fought and died for something they believed in. It was not long after that, after he was president, that he actually dedicated a Confederate memorial in I think in Arlington Cemetery.
Mhm.
So, and as has been mentioned, that he did segregate the civil service, resegregated it, I guess, or he certainly took steps to make things worse in that regard. But I think to answer your question, I think he was certainly, it certainly was useful to him in the convention to have that the Underwood delegations continuing to vote for Underwood instead of doing what would have been understandable and switching to Clark, after certainly after Clark had a majority of the delegates. The 2/3 rule was done away with in the FDR. I think it was after the 1932 convention that they did away with the 2/3 rule. So now it's, of course, anything less than unanimous now is not acceptable. It seems conventions have gotten a lot more boring just in our lifetime.
They certainly have. And on that note, perhaps we ought to call us a day. Dennis, thank you very much. That was a meticulously researched and presented outline of the events leading up to Woodrow Wilson's presidency and some of the events of his presidency. An irony of fate indeed.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.